Hi there. I originally wasn't going to make a video on Cuba, but several people requested it, so here it is. Quick rundown. Nothing of significant note is happening. There were some small-scale demonstrations as a result of local shortages made much worse by the illegal US sanctioning of Cuba. The protests are pretty much over now, and the Cuban government, a very popular government with its people, as will be shown, has responded positively to the people's demands, and the Western press has blown the scale of the whole situation way out of proportion, to serve US foreign policy agendas, as you may assume. They've extensively lied about the motivations of the protests, labeling images and video of pro-government demonstrations as anti-government, and displayed other usual tactics of the so-called honest journalism of the free world. No one is saying Cuba is a paradise with no issues, and first amongst those to admit that is the Cuban government itself. With that out of the way, we can discuss this to a deeper level. At first, there was some small-scale grievance that was primarily economically driven. These can be broken up into three separate issues: fear of vaccine limitations because of needle shortages, electrical grid issues, and food shortages/price increases. As a result of the illegal embargo, Cuba is forced to rely heavily on its tourism sector. Over the past year and a half, though, tourism worldwide has taken a massive hit, and this was even more pronounced within Cuba. As a nation sanctioned for over half a century, the compounding effects of an international pandemic wouldn't be hard to imagine. Unsurprisingly, there were efforts to turn this genuine grievance into a political protest aimed at overthrowing the Cuban government by the US government and its lackeys, mainly through the media. The US government has very little power in Cuba itself otherwise. As for the electrical grid and needle shortage, well, that's also unsurprisingly due to the embargo. In response to this, the US intensified sanctions, clearly the mark of a humanitarian nation. We'll talk about this in a second. Let's take a look at how this was reported first. Firstly, with only a few hundred people protesting in Havana, prominent US politicians were already calling for US military intervention into Cuba, along with calls for the assassination of Cuban officials. Had Cuban officials stated this about the US, we'd never hear the end of it. That's just the beginning. In the modern era, especially with the advent of the internet, a lot of fake outrage can be generated and pushed on platforms like Twitter, Facebook, etc. This shouldn't be new to you. In fact, this is how NATO-backed color revolutions have taken form for the past 10 years now. In Cuba's case, they were especially lazy. Spanish analysts found that prior to the beginning of the protests, the first use of the hashtag SOSCuba came from Spain, with an automated retweet rate of 5 per second. The exact pattern of fake, newly made accounts posting from what basically is a script is eerily similar to the campaign against Evo Morales at the time of the fascist coup against him just a little while back. They even make the same typos, if you can believe it. Combine this with follower farming and automatic retweets, and you have an astroturfed color revolution ready to go. Even with all this tireless effort on the part of the US government and the media, the protests and their turnout was disappointing. The media, obviously not getting the images they'd like from the small and scattered protests, decided to outright lie by attempting to pass off images and video of protests in other places, for example Egypt or other Latin American countries, as Cuban protests. They even used footage of protests in Miami and passed them off as within Cuba. Not satisfied with this much, they even took footage of pro-government demonstrations and labeled them anti-government demonstrations. On that note, by the way, the support of the Cuban people for their government has been overwhelming. There is no shortage of footage of young people marching and yelling out Fidel, holding out pro-government signs and socialist slogans, yet the media has shown you absolutely none of that, and I wonder why. Actually, they did show you those signs, just blurred out so you'd think it was an anti-government instead of pro-government demonstration. Journalistic honesty. Wanna know how this gets even worse? The UN Human Rights Council used an image of a pro-government demonstrator in their lukewarm statement about the protests on Twitter, and when the woman herself responded saying, "Down with the blockade, long live the revolution," Twitter restricted her account. I should be surprised, but I'm really not. That's not even mentioning the hand the US government has in spinning this narrative. They've been interfering in Cuban affairs since the 60s, with recent examples, aside from the criminal embargo, being an attempted Cuban Twitter for organizing counter-revolutionary mobs and manipulating local opinion, an attempt that colossally failed. Other attempts include the US spending millions of dollars not on their homeless or unemployed, no, but on expat Cuban rappers and other hip-hop artists in hopes of cultivating a cultural counter-revolution of sorts. On top of this, the US government spends tens of millions of dollars on democratic opposition groups, so-called, meaning groups subservient to US agendas. Cuba is more democratic than the US ever was or is. This is just scratching the surface. Not to mention, a lot of all this was framed in a "they're breaking the rules by protesting" narrative, despite the fact that you can protest in Cuba. Interestingly enough, they show you a handful of protests in Miami, but not the dozens of pro-Cuban demonstrations from Russia to Italy, the rest of Latin America, and within Cuba itself. FAIR, an organization that catalogs media biases, had this to say. Media, too, were quick to focus on the story, giving the protests front and center coverage, something extremely unusual for demonstrations in Latin America. Far larger and more deadly movements in Chile and Ecuador were mostly ignored by the corporate press. Meanwhile, the political situation in Haiti, which has seen 3 continuous years of nationwide protests, was overwhelmingly ignored, until the assassination of US-backed President Jovenel Moïse last week. The entire article is really great, by the way, and the writer, Alan McLeod, which too, by the way, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, so apologies. Is it McLeod? Is it McLeod? Excuse me. But he's a great writer, and the article definitely is great, so I recommend you give it a read and check out his Twitter. Take a look at the further reading section in the pinned comment. This is not even mentioning the much larger ongoing protests against Bolsonaro in Brazil this very moment, which are altogether ignored by the CNNs and New York Times of the world. Same goes for the protests in Colombia, which have a turnout of over 1 million people, with very heavy police repression of protesters and dozens killed. But no sanctions from Biden and co., those are saved for socialist countries. I always say this when it comes to the Western press. The truth stands on its own. If they really were in the right, they wouldn't ever need to lie this much. The very fact that they're doing all of this shows who's really in the right. Let's of course not forget the embargo and its explicit purpose. The US government publicly admits the only foreseeable means of alienating internal support, within Cuba, is through disenchantment and disaffection based on economic dissatisfaction and hardship. If the above are accepted or cannot be successfully countered, it follows that every possible means should be undertaken promptly to weaken the economic life of Cuba. If such a policy is adopted, it should be the result of a positive decision which would call forth a line of action which, while as adroit and inconspicuous as possible, makes the greatest inroads in denying money and supplies to Cuba, to decrease monetary and real wages, to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of government. If you bother reading the nonsense the Western press has been writing, you'd see very few, if any, mentions of the embargo, or this explicit statement. Of course, this is by design. If you're unaware, the US has economically blockaded Cuba since the early 60s, limiting inflow of basic goods either directly or indirectly. We're talking even basic medicines and food. They claim that the embargo makes exceptions for these, but that's only for show. The wording is made so intentionally vague as to essentially de-incentivize companies from even considering trade with Cuba. The total amount of wealth lost to this blockade accounts to nearly $8 trillion. That's hundreds of billions for an island nation of only 11 million people. There are a lot of excuses given to the blockade by the US, but we have to remember that there are tons of conditions that are just never mentioned. For example, any ship that trades with Cuba can't enter US ports for 180 days. The US, being the world's largest economy, is effectively barring trade with Cuba for the rest of the world by preventing those countries from trading with itself. Any company that has any assets or trade with the US can be sanctioned and punished for breaking the embargo if they trade with Cuba. Not to spoil the ending, but practically every major company worldwide has some connection to the US. Even companies with no assets or links to the US are targeted, with forceful seizures of their assets or outright banning of company members from entering the US. In essence, the embargo not only prevents goods from physically entering Cuba, but it also is made to be the maximum incentive not to trade with Cuba, all because it refuses to be a puppet of the US. This is not to mention that all this is internationally illegal. The UN voted on this numerous times, and every country on Earth, aside from the US, and of course Israel, voted to lift the embargo. Now tell me, when literally every nation represented by the UN votes to do something, and only 2 countries decide, you know what, I'm not going to do that, who's really the rogue state? The cherry on top is that, according to polling, the majority of Americans would also like to lift the embargo. But no, apparently it's Cuba that needs democracy. This is just a brief side note, but the US really has no right to be pointing fingers. Biden came out stating Cuba has a COVID problem, calling it a failed state. Meanwhile, over 500,000 Americans have died from the disease. When talking of any poverty felt by Cubans, as a result of American policy decisions, the US's own staggering rate of poverty, especially as the richest country on Earth, leaves a lot to be desired. The data is further obscured by incredibly low cutoff values, as a family of 3 is supposed to be not in poverty, quote-unquote, if they exceed the threshold of $19,985. Now, Americans, please tell me, is $20,000 a year enough for a family of 3 to live a decent life? This is, of course, not counting in the lack of medical care, transport, work opportunities, or lack thereof, etc., etc. The true numbers are way higher, and this is implied by the close to the poverty line counts, which measures nearly 100 million Americans, quote-unquote, near poverty. Food insecurity, too, is a massive issue, and has only been exacerbated by the pandemic. To compare, the vast majority of Cubans, over 90% of which, own their own homes. Many Americans are lucky to find a decent place to live in, and when they do, they have to spend over 50% of their paycheck just to exist within the space. Despite the US spending 14 times more than Cuba on healthcare per capita, Cubans have a higher life expectancy despite being a poor third world and embargoed country. Less infant mortality, less disease burden, more physicians per 1,000 people, more hospital beds. They have universal access to medical care, and it's all free. They have free of charge education at all levels, no student debt, no credit debt, higher literacy rates. I could go on. The US, on the other hand, has the highest prison population on Earth. When it comes to protests and violent state crackdowns, the US comes out first in that too, as we've seen over the past little while with the BLM protests. The US has a literal army of homeless next to vacant homes. The only torture camp on Cuban soil, Guantanamo, is run by the US itself. If the US wants to point out problems and call a nation a failed state, maybe they should start with themselves. This isn't whataboutism, this is just putting things in perspective. The protests are practically over. The Cuban government has responded positively, as any truly democratic government would do. US attempts, even with the full might of global media attempting to sway global opinion, failed. This isn't the first time, nor will it be the last. There's a lot more to say on Cuba, but I'll save that for a future video. To add, though, shame on every single left-punching douchebag that calls himself a leftist that immediately and unquestioningly sided against the Cuban people and their government. You fell for all the simplest tricks, and if you haven't changed your mind, well, just know that every single revolutionary movement you idealize, be it the Zapatistas or Catalonia, had you been present at the time, you would have bent over backwards trying to sabotage and condemn them, either as authoritarian, not pure enough, or whatever other form of brain rot that takes place within the liberal mind. Oh Lord. A book I can recommend on Cuba is Cuba and Its Neighbors, Democracy in Motion, by Arnold August, to give you some idea of how their government works. That's all for this time. If you enjoy what I do, then please consider supporting me on Patreon. It really does help. I'd like to thank my patrons, so thank you to Sabrina Apex, Kim Daniel, Benjamin Grandis, Red Revolution, Evgeny Badalov, Sankofa Perspectives, Estix, Cohen, Moisture, Kai Notebohm, Chase, Faro, Eric McDance, Ruby Ishmael, Vico, Elliot, Lennox Powers, Rose Isaac, Demirhan Akademir, Eric Gersovitz, Coffee Without Milk, T. Cujo, Kevin M. Thompson, MyGaz, Lucas, Gabriel N., Admin, Jack Schneidman, Jordan Peterson's Pharmacist, Billy Sango, Turtleman,